Okay, so now we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of Matthew and of Scripture in general. So after we saw Jesus get baptized and his identity is affirmed by God the Father, he's immediately sent out into the desert for a time of fasting and temptation in the wilderness. What is happening here is Satan ends up coming to Jesus and basically tries to subvert his identity as the Son of God, which is really interesting. So what I want to do here is just talk briefly about these temptations and what they meant, and I'm going to ask you at the end of this video to do an in-class assignment, because remember, this is technically in class. I'm going to ask you to do an assignment on how Jesus ends up encountering these temptations throughout his ministry. There's three temptations, and I'll kind of unpack that a little bit, but just so you know what you're going to get yourself into now. If you have read Craybill chapters 1 through 4, he does this very, very well. As we talked in class, Craybill is it's mostly a historical book. In the historical world, it really gives us a great idea of what's actually happening in first century Palestine in Jesus's context, and how that shapes everything, how it shapes these three temptations that Jesus faced. So some other questions that it'd be nice to frame this discussion with is why would these things be tempting to Jesus? Like they're not just arbitrary things that the devil is coming to Jesus with. They're actually real things. Answering the question, why did Jesus reject this temptation? And maybe even saying, what would have happened had Jesus succumbed to these temptations? So in Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 11, the first temptation that Jesus faces is to turn stones into bread. Now, what this represents is the economic plight of Galilean peasants. Really, during this time, you had basically an upper class and a lower class. There really was no middle class. The upper class was about 10% of the population, and the rest of the 90% were the lower. And so there you had huge part of the population that was hungry. They needed food. They worked every single day of their lives for bread. Now, what would happen during this time is kings or those in authority would often use this bread or food as a means to control the people. It's very easy to garner the allegiance of a people group if you feed them. Now, it's interesting to note at this point that Jesus was part of the lower class. So he was one of the 90%. He wasn't in the upper class. We know this because in the Gospel of Luke, his mom, Mary, when she sings her song, if you look in Luke chapters 1 and 2, she describes herself as a woman of low estate. Then, of course, when Jesus was presented at the temple, it's customary to offer a lamb when, in sacrifice, for your child when they were born. But also what was acceptable for those who didn't have the means to provide a lamb was 2 doves. And this is exactly what was provided by Mary for Jesus. So you know that they were a part of this the lower 90% where they didn't have much. So why would this be tempting to Jesus? Well, as I kind of already mentioned, it would provide just a groundswell of support for him in Galilee. You've probably heard the saying that the way to, we would say a man's heart, but I would say anybody's heart really is through their stomach, right? And Jesus can immediately garner the affections of people who are hungry. In the book of John, after Jesus feeds the 5,000, it says that they try to force him to be king because they would want a king who would be able to feed them. So why would Jesus turn that temptation down? Well, it says something about the identity of him, correct? That really solving hunger was just really a short-term fix. He didn't want the people to become dependent upon him. He didn't want to control the people through their stomachs. And he just flatly knew that as soon as they didn't have bread, they would not follow him. They would actually probably turn on him. So Jesus is actually ushering in a new administration, a new way of doing things. This is unlike any of the kings during the day. So later on, in the Gospels, Jesus ends up comparing himself to bread. He actually says, I am living bread. I'm the bread that has come down from heaven, and it's his body that was actually broken for others as that bread. So that's some information a little bit on the first temptation. The second temptation was to go to the temple and to throw himself down in the middle of the temple. And of course, the devil says that God will miraculously save you in front of everyone there, but particularly in front of one group, and that was the religious leaders. Now, if you think about it, if you're going to run for president, you need to get the support of different groups, like endorsements, right? So the first temptation was almost just, endorsement from the people. This one is an endorsement from the religious leaders. If he did a miraculous deed at the temple, he could get that. So the temple was actually at the very heart of Jewish identity and worship. It contained the altar for the Day of Atonement. It symbolized the very presence of God. It actually had 18,000 priests and Levites there every single day that were operating the temple. The high priest was there. The high priest ruled the Sanhedrin. And the high priest was kind of like the Pope during that time. It was the Jewish spokesperson for political negotiations. So this high priest would go and negotiate with the other political leaders and other rulers. So, and during this time, the Jewish leaders were very much looking for a new ruler that was anointed by God in the mold or in the line of David. So you could see why this would be tempting to Jesus, to garner the affections and get the support of the religious leaders. It would demonstrate his power, his prestige. It would show that he has authority to represent God. It would provide very key allies in a quest to be king. Remember, Matthew called him king when he was born. So if he was going to be king, this might be one way to get very important allies along the way. So the question that we have is, why did Jesus reject this? Well, quite simply, Jesus is not going to force God's hand, right? He's not going to force God to provide a sign of his authority beyond the faithfulness that Jesus himself will demonstrate. We also have to understand that the mode of operation was completely different for Jesus. It was that of a servant savior. Jesus isn't a magician that is bringing attention to himself in an arrogant, grandiose kind of way. So he rejected it, but it was a very real temptation for him. The third temptation is quite simply all power, all authority, all the kingdoms of the world. Now, there's this language of, where Jesus was taken to this mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the world. and that if he would just bow down before Satan, he would get everything that he could see. Mountains during this time symbolized power. One of the rulers during the time was Caesar, right? And Caesar made an entire city. He actually constructed an entire city in the middle of nowhere. He constructed a mountain and put on top of it a place called Caesarea. The same thing that Herod did the same thing on top of a mountain. He called it Herodium. So you can see, I mean, it's not too hard to see how tempting this would be. If you had all power in the world and you could just, snap your fingers like the mad titan Thanos and get your way, would you do it? That would be tempting, I think, for Jesus. And this would be tempting for many reasons. Jesus has already said that he has come to set things right for his people. And this is right before him and on his fingertips. There could be no more civil taxes on Jews. That, as we talked about last week, the Jews were heavily taxed by the Roman Empire. He could end that immediately. Caesar would end up serving Israel. The Roman emperor would end up serving Israel. And since we're talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment from the Old Testament prophecies, there's sort of a vision that Isaiah had, and he writes it in Isaiah chapter 2, where he says that he has this vision where Israel would be set up as chief of all nations, that all the people of the world would flock to the mountain of the Lord, again, that symbol of power. And Jesus has the authority or the possibility to do this. The other thing that the Jews were facing during this time was assimilation into Greek culture. Now, one of the ways this was done is that they were actually put in arenas, and when they were put into arenas like the Olympics, for example, most of the Olympic athletes during the first Olympics and in some of these coliseums, they would actually have to perform nude. They didn't have any clothes on, and there was certain markings on Jews, that being circumcision, and they were actually humiliated because of this. Now, if Jesus had all power, he could put an end to that. They would actually be free. So why would Jesus reject all power in the world? Well, the thing about it is Jesus rejected the worldly means of acquiring power. That's very important. Usually the worldly means of acquiring power is via violence and force and coercion. And Jesus is about something else. We're talking about a completely new administration, not the status quo. And of course, simply he rejected it because he would not bow down to Satan, which would ultimately symbolize a permanent subservient relationship to Satan if he would bend his knee to him. If Jesus operated this way, Satan would win because the means by which the world operated would remain unchanged. And Jesus would be just another ruler in line with all of the other rulers, operating no differently. But we know Jesus is different. So what you have an assignment now. After you've done the historical world assignment, the temptations narrative, and you kind of know a lot of the historical world that's important for understanding Matthew 4, 1 through 11. I want you to look forward now. And explore. You're going to have to look. This is going to take some time. You're going to have to look through Matthew, and you're going to have to kind of see how does Jesus encounter these different groups and these different temptations throughout his ministry. So the first one, remember the bread, which is affiliated with the people. How does he encounter the crowds of people and the temptation to provide bread for them? The second one is the temple and the religious authorities. How does Jesus encounter the religious authorities in the rest of Matthew? Just find a couple examples for that. And then, of course, the last one is power. One way to look at this is via the disciples, the group of disciples. We know that later on, maybe I'll just give you this one over here, but the disciples clamored for political authority in Matthew 20. So what I want you to do is, how does Jesus encounter these temptations? The bread, temple, and all power in the rest of this gospel. And I'll post another journal right below this video where you can explore that.